The desert did not forgive, not even the desperate. The man lay sprawled in the dust, his face pressed against earth baked near to stone. Sunlight hammered down on his back like the flat of a blade, each hour cutting deeper into him. A horse stood a few paces away, reins dragging, its flanks lathered with sweat. The rider had slid from the saddle hours ago, a crimson stain spreading across his shirt, where lead had torn through flesh. His lips moved against the grit, though no sound escaped but a rasp that caught in his throat. Buzzards wheeled above him, shadows drifting like ghosts across the ground. Somewhere distant, a coyote yipped and was answered by another. The land was not cruel. It was indifferent. It would take him back into itself the way it took all things, slow, patient, unfeeling. But his eyes were not closed yet. Through the haze of fever, he remembered voices, men laughing over a fire, the clink of bottles, the hard clasp of hands that once meant loyalty. They had been his brothers. So he thought. The memory twisted, and now he saw their faces sneering, heard the crack of rifle but slamming into his ribs, the gloating as he fell. He had ridden with them into the canyon, believing it was for justice. Instead, they had dragged him into betrayal. Gold was worth more to them than blood, and so they had left him broken in the dust, the weight of his trust as heavy as any stone upon his chest. He drifted in and out of darkness. At times he thought he heard his own voice praying. Other times he cursed until his throat was raw. His hands clawed the dirt, pulling himself inches at a time toward shade that always seemed further than it was. The desert tested him, each moment whispering that surrender would be easier than the next breath. Night fell. The cold bit deeper than the heat had burned, and he trembled with fever. His blood caked into his second skin. He thought he saw figures at the edge of his vision, shapes in the fire of the stars, faces of men long dead, and among them, the ones who had left him to rot. He called to them with cracked lips, rage stronger than pain. The rattling of a wagon wheel woke him. For a long moment, he thought it was only in his head. The creak, the steady crunch of hooves across stone. Then a shadow bent over him, blotting out the moon. Still breathing, a voice muttered, low, husky, warmed by smoke and dust. A woman's voice. He could not answer, only stare with wild eyes. She studied him as one might a wounded animal, torn between mercy and practicality. Her face was lean, carved by sun and sorrow, a scar running down the edge of her jaw. She carried herself as one who had long ago abandoned softness. She knelt, pressing a hand against his wound. He groaned, the sound torn from deep within him. "Bullet's still in," she said, almost to herself. She hesitated. The desert urged her to leave him. The desert always urged leaving behind what could not carry itself. But there was something in his gaze, even blurred by fever, a fire, stubborn and smoldering, that refused to dim. She swore under her breath, fetched water from a skin, and tipped it against his lips. He drank greedily, choking. She pulled him upright with strength that belied her frame and half-dragged, half-lifted him into the back of her wagon. The boards creaked beneath his weight. He faded again, slipping into a world of red and black, where gunshots rang and laughter echoed. When he woke, the crackle of firelight painted the cabin walls. The air smelled of smoke, whiskey, and herbs bitter enough to sting the nose. He tried to sit, but pain speared through him, forcing him flat. She appeared in the shadows, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hands red from blood she'd already scrubbed away. "You've got two choices," she said flatly. "Fight to live, or let the dirt finish what those bastards started. I won't waste my time if you're only going to die on me." His voice was ragged, each word torn through dry lips. "I'll live." The corner of her mouth twitched, not a smile, but some flicker of acknowledgement. She set a knife into the fire, the blade glowing orange. Then hold still. Agony followed, white and searing. He screamed until his voice failed, and when it ended, he lay drenched in sweat, chest bandaged tight, breath shallow but steady. She did not offer comfort, only poured whiskey into a cup and pressed it into his shaking hand. "Drink. Sleep if you can. Tomorrow you'll want to crawl into the grave you escaped tonight." He drank. The whiskey burned like fire and steadied his trembling. As sleep dragged him back under, her voice reached him again, softer now, though still edged with iron. Whatever you're carrying in those eyes, it'll kill you if you let it. The night stretched on. Outside, coyotes sang under the indifferent moon. Inside, the wounded man dreamed of the canyon and the laughter of traders fading into the distance. He dreamed of fire not consuming, but forging. When morning came, the cabin door creaked open, and the woman stepped out to tend the horses. Inside, the man stirred, eyes opening to the pale light cutting across the room. His lips moved, barely a whisper, a vow spoken to no one but himself and the land that had refused to claim him. "I'll live," he rasped, breath trembling, "and I'll make them pay." The fire in his heart had survived, and far across the prairie, a storm was gathering. The days that followed were measured not in hours, but in the grit it took to move from one breath to the next. He lay in the cot as the woman worked her land in silence, her figure framed against a sky as wide as eternity. From his place inside the cabin, he watched her return each evening with dust on her boots and fatigue in her shoulders, though she never complained. She fed him broth, forced him to sit up, made him swallow even when he gagged. She was not gentle, but she was steady. He grew stronger, if only because her sharp eyes allowed no weakness to go unchallenged. Pain was his tutor. Every attempt to stand left fire in his ribs. Yet each stumble drove him harder. When she placed an axe in his hands, he could barely lift it. By dusk, he had split only a few pieces of wood, each strike sending tremors through his chest. Still, he raised the axe again. At night, when fever sweat clung to him, he thought of the canyon, of laughter fading as they rode away, and he forced himself to rise again in the morning. He trained his body as a blacksmith hammers flawed iron, determined to forge strength from what had been broken. The woman rarely spoke of herself. Only fragments slipped free, glimpses of family buried long before he stumbled into her life. Once, he saw her standing by the window long after midnight, staring out into the dark as if expecting someone to appear. Her jaw was tight, her hands trembling. Yet when she noticed his eyes on her, she turned away, hardening back into the mask she wore. He understood enough. Pain lived inside her too, and silence was the armor she chose. When he could ride again, she handed him a rifle. Her gaze was unblinking, measuring, as though she sought proof of the resolve he had whispered by her fire. He lifted the gun, hands shaking from weakness. The first shot cracked wide into empty sky. She said nothing, only reloaded and placed it back in his hands. Shot after shot, he missed, his frustration boiling until he cursed aloud. She stood unmoved, the desert wind tugging at her hair, and finally spoke. "You don't miss because your hands are weak. You miss because you're already thinking about the men you'll point it at. Aim at the target, not the ghosts." Her words cut deeper than any bullet, for he knew she was right. Each time he lifted the rifle, he saw not the wooden post, but faces. Their smirks, their betrayal, the moment they turned away. Rage blurred his sight. Only when he forced himself to breathe, to see the post for what it was, did his shot find its mark. A sliver was splintered, and the sound echoed louder in his chest than thunder. The cabin became less a refuge and more a crucible. By day he worked, rebuilt his body, and relearned the feel of steel in his hand. By night he listened. She told him once, while sewing up a torn sleeve by lamplight, that the world takes without apology. "If you want to keep anything," she said, eyes never leaving the thread, "you have to bleed for it. Otherwise, someone else will make sure you lose it." He thought of the gold, of the canyon, of the so-called brothers who had chosen greed. He thought of the life they had stolen from him, not just in blood but in trust. Her words became his anchor. Bleed if you must, but take something back. Weeks later, strength returned enough for him to ride into town. She rode beside him, though he noticed her jaw set harder with every mile. Town was no refuge, only another kind of wilderness. Dust coated the main street, dogs fought in the alleys, and eyes followed every step of a stranger. Inside the saloon, smoke hung thick, and the piano faltered to silence when they entered. Whispers stirred. He caught fragments, his name, long thought dead, spat like a curse. He learned quickly that the men he hunted had not vanished. They had thrived. The posse that left him for dead now held sway over the town. their pockets heavy, their guns quick, their reach long. The sheriff turned a blind eye, fattened by their gold. Ordinary folk kept their heads low, pretending not to notice, surviving in silence. His jaw clenched as he listened, though the woman's steady hand on his arm kept him from rising too soon. Patience was not his nature, yet he knew one man could not storm a fortress built of fear. He returned to the cabin with more than rage now. He carried purpose, sharpened by truth. It was on a dusky evening, when he was returning from the creek, that he heard shouting. Down by the trail, a boy knelt in the dirt, 3 men circling him, laughing as they kicked dust into his face. He was slight, his skin darker than theirs, his features marking him as caught between 2 worlds that welcomed him in neither. One man shoved him hard enough to drop him to the ground. "Half-breed mud," he sneered. The boy spat blood but did not cry. Something in the sight pulled at the man's chest. Without thinking, he stepped forward. His boots struck the earth with weight that made the tormentors turn. They saw the scarred figure, the eyes that burned with something feral, and they hesitated. He said nothing, only stared. Silence proved sharper than threat. One by one, the men muttered curses and slunk away, leaving the boy trembling in the dirt. The boy looked up, his lips split, blood trailing down his chin. "Why'd you do that?" he asked, voice hoarse. The man crouched beside him, steadying him with a hand. "Because I remember what it feels like." The boy did not leave after that. He lingered near the cabin, shy but persistent, fetching water, helping with firewood, watching with wide eyes whenever the man practiced with his rifle. There was hunger in him, not for food, but for belonging. The woman frowned, wary of another mouth to feed, but she did not turn him away. Perhaps she recognized in the boy the same fire she had seen once in the man. One night by the fire, the boy asked a question that had burned inside him since that day on the trail. "Why didn't you let them finish me off?" The man stared into the flames, the light etching shadows across his scarred face. He answered slowly, voice low and deliberate, "Because no one who's been left to die should have to die alone." The boy nodded, as though the words carved themselves into him. The woman said nothing, though her eyes softened for the first time since he had known her. The fire crackled. Outside, the prairie wind carried the scent of rain. Inside, the 3 of them sat together in silence, not quite a family, not quite strangers. Something unspoken bound them, a thread of loss, of survival, of defiance against a world eager to bury them. The man knew his war had not yet begun, but for the first time since the canyon, he did not feel alone, and that, more than steel or gunpowder, gave him strength enough to face what waited on the horizon. The town crouched on the horizon like a predator, its crooked rooftops jagged against the pale dawn. He, the woman, and the boy rode in silence, dust rising behind their horses. Each hoofbeat carried weight, not only of distance but of memory. For the man, every step closer was a return to the night he had been left bleeding, his so-called brother's laughter still echoing through time. For the woman, it was a return to a life she had tried to bury beneath solitude. For the boy, it was entry into a place where his bloodline would mark him as prey. The main street greeted them with stillness. Shutters creaked, though no wind moved. A mangy dog nosed through scraps, growling when boots struck boards. Faces appeared in windows, wary, curious, afraid. The town had not forgotten the man. Whispers had reached its edges weeks ago. His survival was rumor until now. As he dismounted, all sound seemed to pull back, the piano in the saloon halting mid-note, conversation breaking into silence. Eyes trailed him like gun barrels, measuring whether he was flesh or ghost. Inside the saloon, smoke hung thick as fog. Cards slapped against the table in the corner. But even that sound faltered when he stepped through the door. The boy lingered near the threshold, caught between fear and stubbornness. The woman stood close to his shoulder, every movement calm, though her gaze scanned the room for threats. At the bar, one of them sat, broad, scarred, a face the man knew too well. A betrayer, once called brother, now fat with power. Recognition flashed across that face, followed by disbelief, then unease that curdled into anger. "You're supposed to be bones in the canyon," he spat, rising to his feet. The saloon hushed, air tightening as hands drifted toward gun belts. The man did not answer. He only looked, and the silence between them carried heavier than words. The betrayer barked a laugh, too sharp, too forced. "Walk away. You've already been buried once." But the man did not move. His stillness was its own kind of threat. It was the woman's hand, brushing his arm, that drew him back. "Not yet," she murmured, low enough for only him to hear. She was right. Vengeance spent too soon would waste everything. The sheriff appeared then, pushing through the doors, his badge catching the lamplight. His eyes were slick, his smile wide and false. Now, he drawled. "Let's not spill blood in here. Stranger, you've no business in this town. Best you ride on before you find trouble that'll stick." The man studied him, reading the cowardice dressed as authority, the weight of gold behind his words. The sheriff served not the law, but those who lined his pockets. And those men, the betrayers, watched now from shadows, testing the ghost they thought buried. They left the saloon under the sheriff's watchful eye, but the message was clear. Stay, and you'll meet the noose or the grave. The boy's fists were balled as they walked back into the street. "You could have killed him," he hissed. "Why didn't you?" The man knelt so his gaze met the boy's. "Because killing one dog doesn't end the pack." The boy's eyes flashed with anger, but behind it was respect. He was learning patience, though it cut as sharp as hunger. They waited. Days bled into nights. The trio lodged at the edge of town, where the prairie grass whispered of storms. The woman gathered whispers in the market, her ear tuned to fear hidden beneath everyday chatter. The boy listened at back doors, darting like a shadow. Piece by piece, the truth surfaced. The betrayers ruled here not only through fear, but through hunger. They controlled supplies, dictated prices, strangled the town with invisible chains. Each night, by firelight, the three spoke little but planned much. The woman cleaned her rifle with hands steady despite years of disuse. The boy mapped alleys in the dirt, his memory sharp, eager to prove himself. The man sat quiet, sharpening his knife, the sound steady as a heartbeat. Their silence was not emptiness. It was the weight of resolve. One evening, the boy did not return at the usual hour. The woman paced, her jaw set tight, but before worry turned to panic. He stumbled into camp, bruised and bloodied. He had been caught snooping near the stables, cornered by two outlaws. He bore the marks of fists, yet he had escaped with knowledge, a secret stash of weapons hidden in the barn, enough to arm half a town if they dared rise. The man washed the blood from the boy's face with water cold from the well. "You're reckless," he said, though his voice carried no anger. Instead, it carried pride. The boy grinned despite the split in his lip. "Reckless saved us something worth knowing." The woman shook her head, but her eyes softened. In the boy's bravery, she saw a reflection of the man she had dragged from death. The days grew heavier, tension thickening like storm clouds. Whispers spread that the betrayed rider had returned. Fear rippled through the gang, though they laughed too loud in the saloon, drank too much, boasted too long. They remembered the canyon differently than he did. They remembered a man broken. What rode into their town now was something else. On the eve of their strike, the trio gathered by the fire one last time. The flames painted their faces in red and shadow, each marked by scars unseen. The woman's voice broke the silence. "If we do this, we don't stop halfway. They'll come with everything they have." The man met her eyes. "They left me once. They won't get the chance again." The boy leaned forward, eyes alight with a fire far older than his years. "They think we're already beaten. Let's prove them wrong." The fire cracked, sparks spiraling into the dark. None of them spoke again. Words had done their part. Steel and powder would speak next. As dawn approached, the town lay quiet, unaware of the storm ready to break upon it. The man cleaned his revolver one last time, movement slow, deliberate, ritualistic. The woman checked her rifle. The boy tightened the strap of his knife. The prairie wind shifted, carrying the scent of dust and rain. Somewhere in the silence, a rooster crowed, brittle and thin. The man rose, holstered his gun, and looked toward the crooked rooftops waiting on the horizon. His voice was scarcely more than a whisper, yet it carried the weight of everything he had endured. "They left me to die." Now they'll learn what that mistake costs. The first rays of morning cut the sky, and with them, the promise of blood. The sun climbed, slow and merciless, burning the last of the dawn haze from the sky. The town still slumbered when the first boot struck its street. 3 figures moving with purpose, shadows stretching long across the dust. Dogs barked from behind fences. A shutter banged open, then snapped shut. The air carried that fragile stillness before thunder breaks. He walked to the front, shoulders squared, revolver heavy at his side. The woman kept close, her rifle cradled against her chest, eyes sharp as glass. The boy trailed only a step behind, knife strapped his belt, his jaw set with resolve that made him seem older than his years. Together. They were not an army, but they moved as if the land itself marched with them. The first outlaw spotted them from the saloon porch, his cigarette half burned between his lips. He blinked once, then twice, before the cigarette fell. Recognition widened his eyes. He shouted, the sound cracking through the air, and with it, the fragile silence shattered. Doors flew open. Boots thudded. Steel rasped free of leather. The betrayers emerged from every corner. Faces once familiar now hardened into enemies, their laughter from the canyon echoing in his mind. The man's hand drifted to his revolver, but did not yet draw. His voice, low and steady, rolled across the street. You left me in the dust. Now I've come to return the favor. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the world erupted. Gunfire tore the silence apart. Glass exploded from windows. Horses screamed and bolted. The man's revolver barked, one shot, then another, each strike measured, deliberate. An outlaw fell clutching his chest. Another spun and dropped in the dirt. The woman's rifle cracked sharp as lightning, her shot knocking a man clean from the balcony above. The boy darted low, swift as a coyote, pulling the legs from beneath one gunman who had cornered him, then burying his knife deep with a cry that tore from his very soul. The air was smoke and screams, bullets whining off walls, dust choking the throat. He moved through it all as if born to it, his face carved in grim focus. One by one, he found them, faces from his memory. Each one answered with fire and steel. Every shot carried weight, not of vengeance alone, but of justice twisted by betrayal. The sheriff appeared at last, stumbling from his office, pistol drawn, face pale beneath his bluster. He aimed not at the man, but at the boy, desperation guiding his hand. Before the trigger broke, the woman's shot rang out. The sheriff's weapon clattered to the ground, his arm split by her bullet. He fell back, scrambling, begging now where once he had ruled with smug arrogance. The woman strode forward, rifle leveled, every step ringing with years of silence cracking open. She could have ended him then, but her gaze lingered, her finger slack on the trigger. With a snarl, she lowered the rifle and seized him by the collar instead, dragging him into the street. She cast him before the town's eyes. Here is your law, she spat. Bought, bent, broken. Let him live, so you can see what cowardice looks like. Shame did what her bullet had spared. The sheriff crawled away, a husk of his former power. Still the fight raged. Only one remained now, the leader, the one he had once called brother. He stood at the far end of the street, tall, calm, revolver gleaming in the sun. Around them, the echoes of battle faded. Townsfolk gathered at doorways, wide-eyed, silent witnesses to the reckoning. The man walked forward, each step steady despite the ache in his side, the blood dampening his shirt anew. His former brother grinned, though the smile was thin, nervous beneath his bravado. I should have finished you myself, he said, voice carrying across the space between them. Didn't think the desert would spit you back out. You should have made sure, the man answered, his voice quiet but cutting. Now it's too late. They faced each other in the full glare of the sun. Time stretched. The street held its breath. Dust swirled, golden in the light, as if the land itself paused to watch. The leader drew. The man's revolver cleared leather in the same breath. One shot cracked the air. The leader staggered, eyes wide in disbelief, blood blossoming red across his chest. He dropped to his knees, mouth opening as though to speak, but no words came. A moment later, he collapsed into the dirt, the earth claiming him at last. Silence followed. Not empty silence, but one weighted with release. The town exhaled, as though chains had been cut loose. The man holstered his revolver, hand trembling, though not from fear. The boy stepped to his side, eyes wide, chest heaving. The woman lowered her rifle, her face unreadable but her stance no longer burdened. The people of the town emerged hesitant, blinking into the light, their eyes turned not with fear, but with something like hope. Still, the man did not linger. He had not come for their praise. He had come for his own reckoning, and it was done. He turned from the bodies, from the dust-stained street, and walked toward his horse. The woman joined him, her step steady, as though she had carried this weight too long, and was glad to finally set it down. The boy followed, shoulders squared, his knife still stained but his spirit unbroken. Together they mounted, 3 silhouettes framed against the reddening horizon. The man looked back only once, his gaze sweeping across a town that had seen both his death and his rebirth. He did not smile, but the fire in his eyes no longer burned with vengeance alone. It burned with something steadier, something stronger. "They left me to die," he said, voice low, for himself alone. "But I rose to live." The wind carried the words into the vast silence of the prairie. Behind them lay ashes and endings. Ahead stretched open land, unclaimed, unwritten, as their horses carried them forward. The boy let out a laugh, brief, breathless, yet alive. The sound startled even him, but it carried, bright against a fading day. The woman glanced over, her face softening in its shadows. The man said nothing, but the corner of his mouth twitched, almost enough to be called a smile. The sun dipped low, setting the horizon ablaze. 3 riders cut their path across it, the land swallowing their silhouettes, the story not ending but beginning anew. And as the last light fell, the fire in his heart burned on, unextinguished, eternal.